This is the week of December 3rd, 2018, and you're tuned into The Revolution. In today's episode, you'll be hearing two articles that appear in this week's edition of Revolution newspaper, as updated on the website RevCom.us, the voice of the Revolutionary Communist Party, USA. First, on the new U.S. climate report, a dire warning from the scientific community. Also today, trapped in Tijuana, their asylum claims stalled. Hundreds of refugees storm the U.S. border.
On the new U.S. climate report, a dire warning from the scientific community. Quote, Earth climate is now changing faster than at any point in the history of modern civilization, primarily as a result of human activities. The assumption that current and future climate conditions will resemble the recent past is no longer valid. End quote. These are the first words of a major report the U.S. government just released, which shines a light on the horrific impact of climate change today and in the future. Impacts, Risk, and Adaptation in the United States, Fourth National Climate Assessment, NCA4, was produced by 300 experts from government, indigenous communities, national laboratories, and universities. It has been approved by 13 federal agencies. A dire future. If greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise at the present rate, the future world we will face will be grim, according to the report. Almost every sector of U.S. society and economy, including air and water, forest, agriculture, power, transportation, biodiversity, the infrastructure, the coastline, urban and rural areas, health, and much more will be transformed. Andrew Light, an author of the report and a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, said that if there is not a significant reduction in carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions, quote, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of lives every year that are at risk because of climate change, and hundreds of billions of dollars, end quote. The report states clearly that because of climate change, our future on the planet will be very different than it is at present. Quote, the ecological resources that people depend on for a livelihood, protection, and well-being are increasingly at risk, end quote, according to the report. Quote, and future generations can expect to experience and interact with natural systems that are much different than those that we see today, end quote. Wildfires, which are already taking a horrific toll, will increase greatly in number and intensity. According to the report, burn areas in Southern California could double by 2050. In the Southeast, wildfires would also increase and intensify, as they have been in California and the West, drowning large parts of the country, not just the West, in toxic air. In the Arctic, annual average temperatures have increased more than twice as fast as the global average, according to the report. The report predicts that, quote, by mid-century, it is very likely that the Arctic will be nearly free of sea ice in late summer, end quote. The report says that Atlantic and Eastern North Pacific hurricane rainfall and intensity are projected to increase, as will storm surge. Nearly 5 million people in the U.S. live in communities that are within 4 feet of the local high tide level. If current trends continue, huge swaths of the Atlantic coast, from North Carolina to Maine, will see sea level rise of 5 feet by 2100, making the coastline unrecognizable and forcing millions to relocate. Agricultural production in the Midwest will be disrupted. The report predicts that climate change could result in the production of corn and soybeans and other crops falling by 25% from current levels. Oceans will become more acidic and warmer, damaging ocean ecosystems. This has already led to mass bleaching of coral reefs and outbreaks of coral diseases off the coast of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Florida, and Hawaii. Health will be directly impacted under current climate projections. According to the report, in 49 large cities in the United States, changes in extreme hot and extreme cold temperatures are projected to result in more than 9,000 additional premature deaths per year by the end of the century. Lyme disease carrying ticks and mosquitoes that transmit viruses such as Zika, West Nile, and dengue will spread to new areas, causing new outbreaks of these diseases. The northeast habitat for the Asian tiger mosquito, which spreads West Nile virus, will expand by a factor of 10 by the end of the century, quote, exposing more than 30 million people to the threat of dense infestations by this species, end quote, according to the assessment. Importantly, the report emphasizes that it looks at ways that the results of climate change can interact, magnifying the risk. Quote, impacts affecting interconnected systems can cascade across sectors and regions, creating complex risk and management challenges, end quote, the climate assessment says. Quote, for example, changes in the frequency, intensity, extent, and duration of wildfires can result in a higher instance of landslides that disrupt transportation systems and the flow of goods and services within or across regions, end quote. Quote, most climate studies have considered only relatively gradual continuous changes in the Earth's climate system, end quote, the report says. Quote, however, there are a number of potential tipping points in the climate system, points where a threshold is crossed, resulting in a substantial change in the future state of the climate system, regionally and/or globally, end quote. While NCA4 contains much new information and analysis, which we should learn from, it is marred by basic methodological and political problems. It largely takes as its focus the impact that climate change is having on the U.S. economy, the U.S. military, and the U.S. position in the world, often reducing impacts to crudely financial terms. One of the many examples is when the report cites severe flooding in Thailand in 2011, which resulted in 815 deaths and disrupted the lives of 13.6 million people and caused great damage to the environment. This is treated not as a humanitarian and environmental crisis. Instead, the report talks about how the supply chains for the U.S. electronics companies were affected. It is absurd and profoundly wrong, and not scientific, to look at something like the oceans from the point of view of what the U.S. can get out of them. Oceans, and fundamentally the entire natural world, are something that humanity should leave in better condition for future generations of people and plant and animal life everywhere. Climate change is now. The previous U.S. climate assessment, issued just 4 years ago, largely spoke of climate change as something in the future and the worst outcomes as something future generations would see. This new climate assessment incorporates a great deal of scientific advances and also a lot of new investigation and work. For example, it notes that because of scientific advances, it is now possible to see how climate change is behind many of the extreme weather-related events of recent years, such as hurricanes, floods, drought, wildfires, tornadoes, and heat waves. And it brings out example after example from many parts of the U.S. of how this is happening. Quote, high temperature extremes and heavy precipitation events are increasing. Glaciers and snow cover are shrinking, and sea ice is retreating. Seas are warming, rising, and becoming more acidic, and marine species are moving to new locations toward cooler waters, end quote, the authors write. Quote, flooding is becoming more frequent along the U.S. coastline. Growing seasons are lengthening and wildfires are increasing. These and many other changes are clear signs of a warming world, end quote. According to the report, in just the last 3 years, the United States has experienced 44 major climate-related disasters, with more than $400 billion in damages. Tornadoes that struck the Midwest in March 2017, wildfires in the western states, the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, which destroyed much of Puerto Rico, the 2017 drought that caused $2.5 billion in agricultural damage in the northern Great Plains, and many other events all can be linked to climate change. The report brings out the disproportionate harm that climate change is bringing to poor communities, and especially to indigenous people. For example, in Louisiana, the tribal community of Ile de Jean Charles is being forced to move in response to severe land loss, sea level rise, and coastal flooding. They have lived on the island since 1830 when they moved there to escape the Indian Removal Act. The same factors are also forcing tribal communities to be displaced in Alaska. Trump attacks the report. The Trump administration's response to an extensively researched 1,600-page report prepared by government agencies and scientists, and which warns of profound disruption to society, is cover-up and dismissal. It attempted to bury the report by releasing it on Black Friday. One of the report's editors said, quote, "They dropped the report on Black Friday. And you know it's the press who calls releasing anything on a Friday afternoon, taking out the trash. This was burning it and burying it in the backyard," end quote. The New York Times ran a major article discussing the fact that the Trump administration had considered rewriting the report or blocking it in other ways, but had decided instead to issue it as written as an official government report, and then just ignored and denied everything it said, and refused to carry out even the mild measures that the report advocates. The former head of the Environmental Protection Agency under Bush 1, William Riley, said, quote, "This is a new frontier of disavowance of science, of disdain for fact," end quote. Quote, No, I don't believe it," end quote, was Trump's first response 3 days after the report's release. Sarah Sanders and commentators on Fox News said that the report is only based on worst-case scenarios, which a 10-second glance at the report would refute. The fact that the report was written and then released without being changed, despite the open and well-known intense hostility and hatred of the Trump regime to climate science and science in general, points in part to how there are scientists and environmental advocates throughout the government who are not folding in the face of the attacks, but continuing to fight even within the government for a scientific approach. And the report and its treatment by the regime have been taken up by ruling class forces like the New York Times and the Democratic Party to take pokes at Trump. These ruling class forces agree that human activity is causing climate change, admit that many of its impacts are real, and claim to want to stop it. But despite the fact that the existence of human civilization could be at stake in how people respond to climate change, they have no answer, constrained by the very workings and imperatives of the system they preside over. We must stop capitalism and imperialism from destroying the planet. The National Climate Assessment has revealed much about the extent of the climate catastrophe that mankind faces and what we will face if the trajectory is not reversed. Quote, "It shows us that climate change is not a distant issue. It's not about plants or animals or a future generation. It's about us living now." End quote. Catherine Hayhoe, an author of the report and an atmospheric scientist at Texas Tech University, told The Guardian, "We must act now with the urgency that the situation demands to fight against the devastation caused by climate change and work to make revolution, to put an end to the capitalist imperialist system and stop the destruction of the planet."
Trapped in Tijuana, their asylum claims stalled, hundreds of refugees stormed the U.S. border. More than 6,000 Central American migrants and refugees, mostly from Honduras, have been stranded for weeks in a sports complex turned refugee camp in Tijuana, Mexico. The numbers are expected to grow to 10,000 in coming weeks. They've traveled 2,500 miles on foot in caravans, fleeing intolerable violence, poverty, and repression in the countries they left to apply for asylum at the U.S. border. As more refugees arrive each day, they confront an endless wait, because U.S. Customs and Border Protection has intentionally slowed the asylum screening process to fewer than 100 applicants a day at the very time they knew large numbers of refugees were approaching. At this rate, it could take months of waiting in Tijuana before all of these refugees will have their initial screening, at which they must show border inspectors they have a credible fear of persecution if they're forced to return to Honduras or another home country. These refugees, including mothers with small children, are packed into a baseball stadium filled to nearly twice its capacity. People have run out of what money they had. They're sleeping shoulder to shoulder on pieces of cardboard, washing their clothes and showering with cold water from leaking pipes, and standing in line for plates of rice and beans donated by the people of Tijuana. Where does their courage come from? A refugee with her 2- and 5-year-old children told a reporter from the Washington Post, "We're fleeing death. They killed my aunt. I can't even tell you the rest right now, but I'm scared." There are hundreds, thousands more stories like this, now stranded at the border. Tear gas, not asylum, for refugees. The frustration, anger, and fear of what's ahead had been growing day by day when, on Sunday, November 25th, 500 of the migrants decided on a peaceful march to the border to pressure the U.S. to speed up the asylum process. When Mexican federal police and riot gear tried to stop the march, hundreds of marchers maneuvered around them and began running toward and climbing the border wall. U.S. Border Patrol agents, claiming rocks were being thrown, fired tear gas canisters over the border into Mexico. The gas spread everywhere, choking hundreds who had only marched or were just in the area. Mothers were seen fleeing with small children, fearing they would die from the gas they were choking on. For the next 6 hours, the border crossing between Tijuana and San Diego, the busiest in the world, was shut down to all vehicle and foot traffic in either direction. Mexican authorities reported they arrested 39 migrants involved in the events. Then on Monday, they announced they had deported 98 Central Americans involved in the protest the day before. And the U.S. Border Patrol claimed it had arrested 69 migrants who had made it to the U.S. side of the border. The next morning, the Mexican government stationed 500 federal police outside the refugee camp to intimidate any migrants who stepped out. And U.S. officials have announced it will bring federal charges against anyone who crosses the border from now on. Grotesque lies and slander from the top. Trump and his Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, wasted no time slandering the migrants, lying about what had taken place, and using it to whip up hatred toward the thousands of refugees being prevented from applying for asylum. In response to the massive outcry condemning the use of tear gas on women and children, the bullshit out of the mouths of Trump and Nielsen reached new depths. Trump dared claim to the world that these weren't parents but grabbers. He said, they grab a child because they think they'll have a certain status. taking a page from Israel's lies justifying its bombings of occupied Gaza and other hideous crimes against the Palestinians, Nielsen claimed that the Central American immigrants in Tijuana are using women and children as human shields. The fear and white chauvinism these leading fascists are whipping up has a purpose: to make good on Trump's promise that migrants at the southern border will not be allowed into the United States until their claims are individually approved in court. That means even after a refugee arriving at the border has shown a credible fear of persecution, if forced to return where they came from, they will not be granted refuge but be forced to wait years in Mexico or some other country till their court hearing. This is in complete violation of U.S. and international law. But it is another of the fascist norms the regime is trying to hammer into place. The system's brutal answer to the refugee crisis. The Trump-Pence fascists and the capitalist imperialist system they are leading are responding to a refugee crisis. The number of refugees, especially unaccompanied minors and families with small children coming to the U.S.-Mexico border from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador seeking asylum, has skyrocketed since 2014. Of course, it is these refugees who are suffering in this humanitarian crisis. But for the Trump-Pence regime and its fascist base, it is this country, the U.S., that is facing the crisis caused by these refugees. What crisis? For tens of millions with white supremacy in their veins, this country's identity as a white Christian nation is viewed as under attack by the rising number of dark-skinned immigrants. The millions of people who are being forced out of where they live and seeking refuge should be welcomed. But it is also the reality that it is the workings of this system that are responsible for forcing these migrants and refugees from their homelands. And there is no way to solve this unfolding crisis short of a revolution that overthrows this capitalist imperialist system. American imperialism, under Democrats and Republicans, has violated, preyed on, terrorized, and exploited Central America since the 1800s. They turned Honduras into a banana republic at the end of the 19th century, and then invaded it 7 times between 1903 and 1926 to keep it that way. The whole country became a plantation growing bananas and coffee for international companies and a sweatshop for cheap labor. The U.S. turned it into a base for dirty wars in Central America in the 1980s, and in 2009 under Obama, the U.S. backed a military coup in Honduras that has led to killings and violence at unbearable levels. The attacks on the migrants at the Tijuana-San Diego border is part of a fundamental assault on the right to asylum for refugees, including the rewriting of U.S. and international law by Trumpian executive edict. The fascist regime has a lot riding and pushing through with this, and there are great stakes for humanity in whether they are able to succeed. But the answer is not to go back to the program of the Democrats. How did President Obama respond to the humanitarian crisis in June of 2014 when the South Texas border was flooded with unaccompanied minors seeking to escape the gang violence and extreme poverty? He immediately requested almost $4 billion from Congress, but not to provide comfort, shelter, and help connecting with family members. It was entirely directed towards speeding up the apparatus designed to send these immigrants back to the hell they fled, to expand the number of holding cells so they could all be safely caged, and to lock down the border of this problem would not arise in the future. There are actual answers to the questions of why all of this is happening in these articles in the RevCom.us American Crime series, and there is a way, through revolution, that all this can change, which can be heard, for example, in this clip from Bob Avakian in the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America. Stop the demonization, criminalization, and deportations of immigrants and the militarization of the border.
Also in this week's issue, from the Revolution Club Los Angeles, answering the call to discuss basics, an important way to become much more scientific. And another innocent black man killed by pigs, Alabama police, murder of Emantic Fitzgerald Bradford Jr.